All right, so week 3 of e-learning has begun. And if you didn't notice the post at the end of last week, I kind of switched up the Google Drive a little bit, made things a little bit more concise and consolidated. And unfortunately, Wednesday, whenever I went through the DBQ portion and I talked about everything and walked through a whole DBQ, for whatever reason, it didn't record. The file got corrupted and it was unable to load up. So I don't have a recording of that from Wednesday. So if you were looking for anything, it's not there. But we're going to talk about Unit 2 today. We're going to walk through some of that stuff. But again, just a reminder, your DBQ is due on Wednesday by 9 a.m., right? So make sure that you get your first DBQ done by Wednesday at 9. So I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about everything else here. All right, so first up, the Google page looks a little bit different now. So I pulled it up here. So whenever you guys get into the file, it's set up this way. All of your assignments are right here where it says assignments, right? You go to this week, open it up, boom. Here's your 2 things you need to do. First one, DBQ. So you need to limit yourself to 45 minutes when you do this. I know that a lot of you are going to want to have more time to write. You're going to be sitting there typing something and you're going to go, oh, wait, I wanted to say this other thing. Don't. Literally at 45 minutes, cut yourself off, stop, you're done, leave it, just stop, right? After that, submit it, all right? Because once you've had that time, just submit it, leave it out of your mind, be done with it, right? The only thing I will tell you is save it as well, right? So save a copy of it so that way you can look back at it and go over things. Because on Wednesday, what's going to happen is everyone that is in here that has completed their DBQ, I'm going to have a discussion session about it, but I'm going to have you guys go into breakout rooms. So whenever you get in here, you're going to go into a breakout room and you're going to talk with like 3 other people. If the numbers work out, something like that. And just literally talk about what problems you ran into, what struggles there were, what you talked about, what you wrote about, just anything else, just so that way you can start getting someone else's feedback on this, right? It's important to be able to bounce ideas off of one another, and it's also important to actually talk about these things. So there's only so much that we can do if you're not actually participating in it, right? So that means that you're going to have to actually do these to participate. I say that because there are people that are not quite doing things, right? So the DBQ, once you open it, literally just start typing right at the bottom here. Just start going, say, hooray, whatever, start typing and go, whatever. If you want to open a new document, you can. If you want to open it in Microsoft Word and upload it, it doesn't matter, right? It literally doesn't matter as long as you actually give yourself the 45 minutes from beginning to end. That includes the reading time. So don't like, oh, I'm going to read all this first. Okay, now 45 minutes starts. No, right? It's all one time frame, right? So you have to read it pretty quick. And then from there, start writing, right? So these are practice, right? As long as you do them, you get credit. It does not matter if you get a 1 or a 9 for the grade portion of the DBQ. What does matter, though, is after you're done with that, I'm going to post a poll question that basically says, on the rubric, what did you score for your DBQ? And I'm going to have you guys score your own to start out with. As we go through with these and as you get a little bit more confident with them, in about 2 or 3 weeks here, you might start scoring other people's as well, just to see how they did as well, right? So that's going to be your first assignment that's due, right? That's due on Wednesday. So please don't leave that off and then all of a sudden go to do it on Friday and go, wait, what? And stare at the page, because it's due Wednesday. You only need 45 minutes. You're only required 45 minutes. It should not take longer because it cannot take longer, right? Some of you do have extended time accommodations. If you have those, that's fine, use them. So those of you who have those already know who you are. You already have paperwork filed with College Board and stuff. So you will have extended time in the actual exam. Use your extended time if you have it, right? But that's the first assignment that's due is the DBQ part, right? So here it is. The second part is this unit review. It's significantly shorter than the other one. I got a bunch of feedback about it and went, all right, let's change, right? So the top part is unit 1. It's on the global tapestry. It's got a lot of similar things to the stuff that you were talking about last week, but you'll notice there's a little bit more of a push here in the Americas. There's some more information from those. It's got some from Southeast Asia. It's got a couple main things about Buddhism in here and China. But the key part that we're going to focus on is getting into Unit 2, which is what we're going to discuss today, right? So Unit 2 is all about networks of exchange. It's all about how these empires communicated with one another, how they traded with one another, and more importantly, how they spread ideas and goods all around the world, right? So the first section of this is all about the Silk Road. If you know nothing else, the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean trade routes are going to be the two things that you absolutely need to know during this time period, right? Because both of them involve exchanges of all kinds of things that set the groundwork for literally the next 1,000 years of history, right? So please make sure that if you know nothing else, you know all about the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean trade routes. So when it comes to the Silk Road, it's important to remember who's in charge of things during this time period, right? So the first set of time period from 1200 up to 1450 mainly is going to be the Mongols, right? So the Mongols are going to be essentially in charge of the Silk Road for the vast majority of this time frame. And that's in here, right? So when it comes to the Silk Road, it's important to realize and identify that it's what connected Europeans and Asian cultures. It allowed the spread of all kinds of different religions, right? So Christianity comes in from Europe. You've got the spread of Islam, thanks to the connections in the Middle East, all the way out into places like the Philippines, right? Buddhism spreads from India all the way up into China and Japan. It is the spreading of these cultures and these religions that also enables people to gain a better understanding of who they are in the world, right? When it comes to goods, remember that mainly things like silk and rice, other products, spices especially, were traded from the East, right? So from China and India over into Europe. And in return, Europeans usually traded with a couple things, mainly weapons, right? They would trade in like steel and iron weapons. They would also exchange in other goods, but mainly though money was going to be how they got most of their stuff, right? So they were exchanging their gold and silver, which they got from other parts of the world for the most part, but right. So Silk Road, it's important. There's a whole bunch of things in here. It's important to actually have a grasp on this, right? Then it's got the Mongols. We talked about them briefly. The Mongols are different than everybody else pretty much, right? They're one of the very first cultures that actually allows different religions. They're not based on a religion for why they conquered other peoples. But more importantly, they have policies of tolerance, and they really allowed the spread of all of these different things to happen, right? They controlled all of the Silk Road. They controlled the roads, so thus they allowed to spread what they wanted to. Indian Ocean trade is by far and away the second most important thing here, right? It is what connected Africa to South Asia. It is also essentially going to be the main hub and connection from China into Asia or into India as well, right? It's hard to get through the mountains that separate them, but it's really easy to ride the monsoon winds down into India. When it comes to this part, it's important to realize this is what connects the Arab world to India as well, because essentially the deserts that existed here because of the Saharan trade routes and camels, the Indian Ocean trade is going to focus mainly on trying to get from one place to another via the ocean, right? There are major technological innovations that occur here. If Trey is in the room, he will tell you it is the lateen sail. He knows this. But it's also things like the compass, the astrolabe, major innovations that allow people to know where they are going when they cannot see any land, right? Traveling from one part of the ocean to the other requires a lot of knowing which direction you're going and being able to rely on. When we talk about trade that exists during this time period, it's also important to acknowledge and realize that this is going to be the main way in which Africa engages in trade with Asia, right? They don't actually do very much land-based trade, but they do a lot of ocean-based, right? In here, you're going to have to list some like goods and services and things that spread this way, and also one religion that was spread via the Indian Ocean. There's two that could possibly be the answer there. There's only one that is the right answer, right? So you've got Hinduism existing in India, and you also have Buddhism existing in India. But along the African side, you mainly have Islam, right? Islam is going to be the dominant religion within the entirety of Africa during the time period. So think about that and understand what it is that allowed one religion to spread into another area over the others. And then that brings us to Africa. So trans-Saharan trade is only possible thanks to camels, right? Because of the camel, it allows people to make it across the desert, because if it wasn't for them and they relied on horses, their horses wouldn't make it, right? So when it comes to trans-Saharan trade routes, it's important to remember that there are essentially three major kingdoms that engaged in trade here. All of them exist mainly under the banner, if you will, of Islam, right? Islam was the dominant religion throughout the time period, but it also was the dominant empire, right? Dar al-Islam is essentially going to be one main area that is all under the umbrella of Islamic rule, right? But we are mainly going to focus on the kingdoms of Mali, Ghana, and then the Songhai Empire, right? So those are the three big ones there. Mali being the one that is arguably the most important, thanks to Mansa Musa. If you don't remember who Mansa Musa is, he's the guy that is the richest dude of all time that spread so much gold that he ruined economies, right? So when it comes to these empires, it's also important to realize they traded in mainly salt, gold, and iron, right? They had those things, but they also had one other thing, and that's people, right? So the slave trade did exist early on, nowhere near the level that it exists later on. So just know that those are going to be the main things that they are dealing with, right? But the vast majority of gold in the entire world came from Africa during this time period. It still does, believe it or not. So as we look at that, it's got a bunch of different things here. And then it talks about some consequences of connectivity. And that's where we're going to really get into Europe, right? So when Europe was during this time period, this is going to be when you think of medieval Europe with your knights and your kings and castles and cool medieval timesy things. But it's also going to be the time period of the Crusades, right? It's also going to be a time when Christians very much did not get along with the Islamic Empire, and we have a massive clash in cultures there, right? But there is this movement from Europeans outward into other places where they're trying to get goods and services from other areas and bring them back into Europe, right? So during this time period, we have urbanization forming in Europe. We also have diffusion. We have the manor systems kind of in place where there's one set lord and he has all of his vassals or his knights underneath him, and then underneath them are all the peasants that work all of the land, right? So when, I totally jumped over all of that part because it was the top part in there, but whatever, you can find it in there later. So when we also look at Europe during this time period, it's important to realize that there are major things that are exchanged during this time, right? We end up with all kinds of food being exchanged from one place to the other, mainly spices being brought in from Europe and into, or I'm sorry, from Asia into Europe. But we also have goods and crops and things going from Africa or from Europe into other places. One of the weirder things that I didn't know until recently is that like oranges didn't exist before this time period. The orange is a blend between an Asian, an Asian pear or an Asian lemon and a grapefruit. But little things like that, like new crops start existing. And it's kind of different to think of, but things start popping up and cultures start blending to form these new different things, right? Um, the other major thing that spreads is, and it's in here as pathogens. And if you don't know what a pathogen is, look at what's currently going on right now. Um, Pathogens are going to be diseases that spread from one person to another. And in this case, the big one that spreads is the plague, right? So the Black Death, the bubonic plague, spreads from one place to another all throughout Europe and Asia. And it is important to note that although the Black Plague is mainly recorded as being affecting Europe the most, I have a, that's weird. Um, the Black Death started somewhere in either India or China. It existed there for a couple hundred years. And then because the Mongols allowed free trade all throughout their entire empire, it was able to spread from China all the way across into Europe. And the Europeans had never encountered it before, so they were devastated by it, right? Whenever it gets into Europe, the main places that get absolutely annihilated that it starts out with is Italy, which if you want to build the connection there and point out the fact that the first place that was absolutely devastated by this major disease as it was spreading was, again, Italy. And they got it from China. If you don't think that history repeats itself, you literally can make the connection between the Black Death and this current pandemic and realize, man, we really haven't learned very much, right? So there are a lot of other things that happen in Unit 1 and 2, and if you have questions about it, by all means, you can ask them, but I'm going to go ahead and stop this now, and if you have questions, fire away.